Yesterday, I found myself in a Twitter spat with Jason Unruhe, who himself is a few weeks removed from controversy where he was subject to contemporary Jacobin leftist firing squads accusing him of being a white supremacist. And what does he do? He caves in to them as far as espousing the erroneous and distorted rhetoric of the contemporary left relative to decolonization and liberation theory. He finds himself extending the same labels applied to him only a few weeks ago outward and applying that same rhetoric to the more orthodox segment of contemporary socialist theorists such as Caleb Maupin and Noah Kratchevik, branding them as neo-Nazis or third positionists for embracing the doctrine of so-called proletarian patriotism. In our dispute, Jason has attempted to even apply such labels to me. But little does Jason and the rest of the third worldists in his sphere of mentality know or understand is that they are the individuals who are espousing the rhetoric of Anglo-saviors in a thinly veiled attempt to liberate the historically oppressed masses as an end to stifle socialist organization in defiance to the crisis that is neoliberalism. At the heart of the discussion framed by the contemporary left, which Jason is unwittingly affiliated with, is the subject of historical criticism based on how the United States was founded and the question of repatriation of what is termed to be stolen lands from indigenous tribes. This contemporary strand of leftist theory does not emanate from grassroots or proletarian currents, no, but rather emanates from socially prestigious bourgeois university systems affiliated with the University of California, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Columbia, Cambridge, and Oxford. Such are university systems that are patronized and owned, and in some cases even named after, by ultra-Norman WASP bourgeois crown colonists, industrialists who married into the European aristocracy in the late 19th century, and aristocratic interests, who for the better part of the past millennia were solely concerned with the suppression of the global proletariat as a means and modes to monopolize resources and prevent collective organization to threaten such attempts at monopolization and privatization. A century ago, these university systems, bankrolled by upper crust Norman WASP interests, embraced the doctrine of scientific racism and eugenics, with the feeling that the First World was becoming too populated by Eastern Europeans and Mediterranean races who were not viewed as racially hygienic or racially pure enough to live within civilized Anglo nations. These destructive and beyond toxic ideas would be adopted by Nazi Germany in a sick and twisted program to cull the herd of undesirables to make the world safe for Norman WASP interests. Today, these ultra-bourgeois interests, which believed in the doctrine of racial hygienics, have since shifted their focus onto climate change and sustainability. Greta Thunberg is their chosen spokesperson, not that they genuinely care about such a phenomenon, which their industrial operations were responsible for, but more so as a means to keep pushing their Malthusian degrowth agenda as a ways and means to suppress the economic development of the global south and third world nations, which they have historically colonized and oppressed, and siphon the wealth from industrial core centers that these WASP industrialists and aristocrats have built to stash their surplus capital away in extra-legal city-states, think the City of London or Vatican City, for example, and nations like Monaco, in the name of preserving their rapidly deteriorating resource monopolies. One of the elements to this Malthusian program instituted by the ultra-bourgeois involves tokenizing and exploiting historically oppressed and dispossessed indigenous tribes as a means to prevent the economically alienated non-indigenous from rallying around their collective economic alienation to combat the economic order of neoliberalism as collective material conditions to decline as far as the public is concerned, while private interests continue to explode in their wealth and influence. Over the past 5 years, ultra-bourgeois nonprofits and foundations have donated hefty sums to indigenous organizations in their indirect attempt to tokenize them and buy them off. Such foundations include the Kellogg Foundation, $52 million, the Cargill Foundation, $22 million, the Bush Foundation, $14 million, the Mellon Foundation, $11 million, the Ford Foundation, $11 million, and the Gates Foundation, $11 million. Most of these organizations, by the way, 100 years ago, foundations and organizations that I just brought up, guess what they were bankrolling? Guess. Could it be eugenics programs? And perhaps Nazi economics? Maybe, yeah. Even Charles, Prince of Wales, the future WASP king of Great Britain, whose uncle married a Nazi sympathizer, mind you, has affixed himself to this trend of ultra-bourgeois interests, putting their chips behind mainstream contemporary leftist decolonization rhetoric, having stated at the 2020 UN Summit on Biodiversity, calling for a new Marshall Plan for a blue-green recovery rooted in a new circular economy that has nature at its center, and went on to list the ways to bring this about. These include implementing carbon pricing, and guess where that money goes? To the top. Accelerating carbon capture technology, including nature-based solutions with profits in mind for the people at the top, and ending perverse subsidies for fossil fuels. Although he declines to mention that, the monarchy that he is a part of has ties to the Bank of England, which has ties to British Petroleum. Speaking of subsidies for fossil fuels, Prince Charles has also stated indigenous leaders understand the environmental threats facing the world, adding that they had always believed in the seventh unborn generation principle, which is an ancient philosophy that considers the impact of decisions made about the land on future generations. So this is Prince Charles saying that the indigenous people were always right, despite the fact that his ancestors colonized and exploited the living shit out of them, right? Taking us back to our original subject, if ultra-bourgeois WASP interests, foundations, NGO and universities, and bourgeois individuals themselves, like Prince Charles, which have either inherited or built their entire wealth on collectively over 1,000 years, because history doesn't start with the United States leftists. Going back to the Crusades, worth of colonialism, exploitation, slavery, land theft, proletarian time theft, and wage theft are now suddenly the same interests who are driving the narrative relative to decolonization and sustainability as a means to push degrowth and Malthusianism to prevent who the aristocrats perceive as irresponsible peasantry from harnessing those resources to improve their conditions. Why, oh why, are these so-called third world self-proclaimed Maoists and leftists like Jason Unruhe and the rest of the dim-witted reactionary Jay Sakai reading contemporary leftists siding with the very bourgeois interests which as leftists they are supposed to be against? in the truest sense of the term, as rooted in the French Revolution. To be so-called left-wing is to be against the crown, right? Why are they siding with monarchs and aristocrats who have shaped contemporary leftist theory as a means to deflect animus away from the 0.01% and instead shift animus onto the descendants of people who immigrated as refugees via Ellis Island to the United States in the late 19th century, and who the ancestors of these aristocratic interests advocated for banning entry into this country and subsequently the genocide of through the process of eugenics and forced sterilization. Are these people really third worldists as they claim that they are, or are they the useful idiots of the monarchists and the aristocratic class doing their dirty work while the bourgeois desperately attempts to grasp tighter and tighter control of the world's resources in the name of disingenuous decolonization and disingenuous sustainability? What more, why are indigenous nations allowing for themselves to be bought off and tokenized by these very interests that would much rather prefer us to be either their 21st century serfs or just all dead outright? The historicity of the matter must not be omitted. The reality of the United States was that, yes, it most certainly was born of original sin relative to slavery, genocide, and land theft. What the Anglo-Wasp businessmen did to the Hawaiian kingdom was beyond abhorrent. The people of Hawaii deserve to have their internationally recognized sovereignty restored, with the intent to benefit private capital. However, the United States was not the root cause of these ills. The root cause of these ills are tied with these still existing hereditary Catholic and Protestant European monarchies constructed on some bullshit fabrication of a divine right of kings and queens to lord and rule over the world as God's chosen and favored earthly representatives. The ideal of the United States was founded upon an outright rejection of this premise, with a narrative driven not by Washington, not by Jefferson, not by Madison, not by Hamilton, or any of these so-called slave-owning founding fathers who betrayed the American Revolution by retaining their financial ties to Great Britain, but instead driven by the anti-monarchist, anti-clerical, anti-elitist, pro-abolitionist Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine's ideas not only sparked the ideal of the American Revolution, where the colonists overthrew monarchist rule, they also sparked the French Revolution, where the non-nobles rose up and committed regicide. The French Revolution inspired the Paris Commune. The Paris Commune inspired Marx, who inspired the Bolsheviks to also commit regicide. The American Revolution was based on the premise that monarchies and aristocracies should have no divine or legal right to exist, to lord and rule over who they perceive to be lesser and inferior peoples. That is why we celebrate July 4th, FYI. What more, the United States of 2021 is not the same United States of 1771. In fact, the United States didn't even exist yet. More than half of the people living in this country today have no such ties to the colonial era. They are not the descendants of the Anglo-Wasp settlers who came on the Mayflower. They are not even the descendants of people who fought in the Union Army or the Confederate Army during the Civil War. They have no ties to the corrupt foundation of the United States whatsoever. They are the descendants of Southern and Eastern European refugees who came here because the monarchy in Europe made their lives a living hell, or the descendants of those who the monarchs or monarch-friendly founders enslaved, or the descendants of indigenous Latin Americans, or the descendants of African, Chinese, and Indian, Pakistani immigrants who immigrated here post-1965. Their ancestors have no direct ties to slavery, no direct ties to indigenous genocide, and no direct ties to any of the unfathomable crimes against humanity committed by the bourgeois Anglo-WASP interests that shape policy decisions of the United States government in the name of enhancing their own private interests under the banner of Uncle Sam. But surprise, surprise, at the urging of academic bourgeois leftism, the very same people who Jay Sakai, third worldists, trots, and anarchists attacked for supposedly being too white, just so happen to be the very same exact people who the Anglo-bourgeois like Theodore Roosevelt and Madison Grant attacked a century ago, making demands for racial hygiene and eugenics because they supposedly weren't white enough to inherit the country that their WASP ancestors stole from the indigenous while they maintained and benefited from slavery. Due to the fact that we live in a declining capitalist nation, capitalism breeds inherently cultural right-wing dispositions. Indeed, many of the lesser white proletariat and petty bourgeois have been subject to 7 decades worth of Cold War indoctrination to denounce socialism and communism. But newsflash, the Cold War ended some 30 years ago. And the system of neoliberalism, with policies geared toward public austerity and privatization, have exposed its filthy hand. People who have historically been bought off by the bourgeois establishment are now turning against the very same Anglo-bourgeois establishment. Are we going out of our way to organize them into a collective, cohesive unit to challenge the Anglo-WASP bourgeois establishment and dismantle neoliberal economics? Or are we doing the dirty work of the Anglo-WASP aristocratic establishment and attacking these people for shit that they and their ancestors literally had nothing to do with, and thus prompting them with negative reinforcement to double down on their backwardness and intolerance, encouraging them to be misled by anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and fascism instead of embracing non-exclusionary socialism? Think about that. There is something inherently demented about leftcoms and progressives who get all their distorted leftist theories from bourgeois academia, whose sole purpose is to educate people to participate in and defend the neoliberal system, which has incorporated climate change sensitivity into its paradigm, by the way, while feigning an elitist veneer as if they know what is best for society, while they brand everyone who doesn't exactly think as they do as so-called Nazis. Isn't it ironic that for all the Nazi witch hunts these so-called leftists initiate and accuse everyone of, they are siding with the very aristocratic interests who have historically bankrolled and enabled the Nazis in the name of Malthusian racial hygiene, those simple, reactionary creatures. They are obsessed with aesthetics, they don't go after the root problem, and they spend much more time attacking Caleb Maupin, and not for nothing, I don't agree with everything that Caleb says, but I'm not going to call him a Nazi when I disagree with him, and less time attacking the Rockefeller Foundation and Prince Charles for using indigenous communities as pawns in their sick and twisted efforts to push neo-Malthusian policy solutions to preserve their wealth. Jason Unruhe, that's his name, and the people of his ilk shouldn't even call themselves leftists. they should call themselves monarchists, because that is simply what they are. Accomplices to the 21st century version of white man's burden, geared for sustainability and decolonization as a means to prevent the historically marginalized from collectively banding together in a struggle to improve their material conditions in resistance to neoliberalism juxtaposed amidst climate catastrophe. Those of us who are sincerely on the left say, down with the crown. And if those on the left who aren't saying down with the crown, they are with the crown, and they need to go down like the fake leftists they are, along with the perverted Anglo-WASP aristocratic interests they are undutifully aligning themselves with. This is Comrade Pella, signing off.